But Ignatieff is a kind of paradigm for that, for the neoliberalism, the new liberal, but Clinton wins the prize. Here you have a figure who speaks in that traditional feel your pain language of liberalism and yet betrays the very constituency that he or she purportedly represents. So you have Clinton ramming through NAFTA, the great betrayal of the American working class, probably the greatest betrayal since the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act, which makes it very difficult to organize. Clinton destroyed our welfare system, and in the old welfare system, 70% of the recipients were children. It was Clinton that deregulated the FCC, which allowed corporations like Clear Channel to buy up most of the radio stations, Rupert Murdoch News Corp. It was Clinton that vastly expanded our prison program, which a lot of people don't know, the omnibus program, exponentially exploding the prison population, very lucrative business, especially for the private prison industry. And it was Clinton that ripped down the firewalls between commercial and investment banks, something that did not happen in Canada because of Chrétien, but something that precipitated not only our national, but the global financial crisis. Clinton got what he was looking for, which was corporate money, so that by the 1990s, the Democratic Party had fundraising parity with the Republicans, and when Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, he got more. And Obama, for me, is a brand. He functions in the same way that, if you remember a few years ago, Calvin Klein and Bennington would have HIV-positive models and people of color on their billboards to associate their products with a kind of progressive politics or risque lifestyle, or whatever. And that's exactly what the corporate state coughed up. And we're now, we start, as soon as somebody's elected president, we begin our new campaign. Now we're all sort of waiting for Hillary Clinton to run, and she can be our new brand. And that's why in 2008, when Obama won, Advertising Age gave Obama its top annual award, which was Marketer of the Year. He beat Nike, Apple, Zappos, because they knew precisely what he had done. Now, the death of the liberal class, and I think that's essentially what's happened, the death of these liberal institutions is extremely dangerous. And Chomsky, this is an analysis I steal from Chomsky, who I think laid it out probably better than anybody. And Chomsky talks about how liberal institutions function as a kind of safety valve. I don't know if those are his exact words. Karl Popper, also in the Open Society and Its Enemies, talks about this, where you have institutions in a capitalist democracy that make incremental or piecemeal reform possible, so that when the economy or capitalism collapses in the 1930s, you are able to draw on a traditional liberal establishment, Roosevelt, Henry Wallace, his vice president, and others, who are able to ameliorate the legitimate grievances and suffering of the underclass. And when Conrad Black writes his biography of Roosevelt, he says that Roosevelt's greatest achievement is that he saved capitalism, and I think that's right. With the destruction of the liberal class, which is ultimately, I think, foolish on the part of these corporate forces, that mechanism is destroyed. That ability to carry out incremental or piecemeal reform is gone. And, there's a writer who spends a lot of time writing about this, and that's Dostoevsky. That's what Demons is about. That's what Notes from Underground is about. It's about the collapse of liberalism. Mouseman is sort of the cynical liberal who retreats underground. And Dostoevsky, who certainly saw what was coming, said that when that happens, you enter an age of moral nihilism. You also enter an age of political paralysis, an inability on the part of the centers of power to respond rationally to what's happening. And if any of you read the New York Times columnist Paul Krugman, he writes week after week calling for a rational response. Now, what would be a rational response to the economic collapse? It would be, at a minimum, a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, a forgiveness of student debt, which is now the largest personal debt in the country, $1 trillion, a call for a jobs program, especially targeted at people under the age of 25. That would be rational. Instead, when these grievances finally push people out into the streets, as they did in the Occupy movement, the response is force. You see the security and surveillance state, which has certainly migrated over the borders into Canada, as anybody who was at the G20 in Toronto understands, attempt to physically erase these movements. And that's very dangerous, because all of the grievances that pushed people into these encampments not only remain, but are getting worse. And so it's always the ruling class that determines the configurations of revolt or rebellion. And because the ruling class has not been able to respond rationally, because we live in a political and an economic system that is virtually paralyzed, which serves exclusively corporate interests, we are headed for political turmoil and upheaval, and the security and surveillance state knows it, which is why both in the United States and Canada you are seeing a ramming through of draconian security laws. In the United States, and this is all under Obama, Obama's assault on civil liberties is actually far worse than the assault against civil liberties carried out by George W. Bush. It was Obama who approved the FISA Amendment Act, which retroactively makes legal what under our Constitution has traditionally been illegal, the warrantless wiretapping, monitoring, and eavesdropping of tens of millions of American citizens. And we now know that all our personal information are being stored in perpetuity in supercomputers out in Utah. Why was it retroactive? Because when, after 9/11, the major telecommunications companies handed over this information in direct violation of our right to privacy, there were a series of cases in the lower courts working their way up. They knew they'd lose, and so their lobbyists made sure that written into the bill was retroactive immunity. It is the radical interpretation of the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act as giving Obama what he sees as the right to assassinate American citizens. It is the use of the Espionage Act 6 times. Now, the Espionage Act is the equivalent of our Foreign Secret Act. It was passed in 1917 by Woodrow Wilson, and it was never designed to shut down whistleblowers. It was designed to function as any Foreign Secrets Act is, which is giving information to a group or nation identified as, quote-unquote, the enemy. It was used 3 times before Obama took office to try and shut down whistleblowers, the first time being against Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers. Obama's used it 6 times, and he just sent a CIA official, Kiriakou, to jail for 30 months using the Espionage Act. Kiriakou exposed the use of torture, purportedly to the New York Times. And then finally, something called the National Defense Authorization Act, Section 1021, which he signed into law a year ago, December 31st. Section 1021 permits the U.S. military to seize citizens who substantially support, that's the language of the section, that's not a materially support, that's not a legal term, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or something called associated forces, again, a nebulous term. Hold them in military facilities. This is overturning 200 years of domestic law, stripping them of due process until, quote unquote, the end of hostilities, which in an age of permanent war is forever. I sued the president, and last September in the Southern District Court of New York, we won. And Obama has appealed it. What was interesting is we knew he'd appealed, but he didn't just appeal. Judge Catherine Forrest, who issued a ruling declaring Section 1021 unconstitutional, on the day of her ruling was visited in her chambers by government lawyers who said that they wanted an emergency stay, meaning put the law back into effect until the next highest court, the appellate court, hears the case. She refused, to her credit. This was a Friday afternoon. The lawyers then went to the appellate court, which is the court before the Supreme Court, and again said they needed an emergency hearing for 9 a.m. Monday morning, which they got. And they asked the court to put the law back into effect until the appeal was heard. The court granted them that temporary stay against the injunction. Now, that was quite telling to the lawyers and to myself, because it can only mean one thing, and that is they're already using the law. And I suspect they're using it against dual U.S. Pakistani nationals in places like Bagram or other black sites. Because if the injunction was allowed to stand and they were holding U.S. citizens and denying them due process, they would be held in contempt of court. So the state fully understands, and you see a series of measures being passed by the Harper government that are a kind of mirror of the creation to this security state. They know what's coming. They know that materially people in the industrialized world will not be able to achieve the level of consumption or comfort that the generations before them achieved. They know that we are rapidly being reconfigured into a kind of global neo-feudalism, a world where workers around the globe are played off of each other, so that workers in Canada or workers in the United States are told that they have to be competitive in a global marketplace, which means being competitive with sweatshop labor in Bangladesh that makes 22 cents an hour, or prison labor in China. There are no impediments left. That traditional liberal class that was able to make reform possible has been vanquished. And that brings us to Karl Marx, who correctly understood that unfettered, unregulated capitalism is a revolutionary force. There's a very fine book called The Great Transformation by Karl Polanyi, written in 1944, in which he writes about the force of unfettered, unregulated capitalism, which essentially, he says correctly, commodifies everything. Everything becomes a commodity. Human beings become commodities. The natural world becomes a commodity that you then exploit until exhaustion or collapse. So 40% of the summer Arctic sea ice melts. And the response of corporate power is to send up ships and drop $500 million drill bits to mine the last vestiges of natural gas and oil and minerals and fish stocks out of the death throes of the planet. And that's precisely what we have evolved into. And the further this distortion goes, the more the systems of information become degraded, so that we replicate, and I speak as an American in the kind of twilight of empire, the kind of moral and intellectual decline that always takes place within empire. And Cicero wrote about this at the end of the Roman Empire, where he talked about how the emotional and intellectual life of the citizen was being invested in the arena, in the spectacle, while all of the institutions of the Republic, while they remained, including the Senate, became a kind of species of political theater, which I think is precisely where we have come to as a culture, which means the only way that we have left to fight back is to step outside the formal mechanisms of power, which is why I was such a fervent supporter of the Occupy movement. None of the traditional mechanisms of power are going to save us. And we can just talk about the environmental crisis alone. They will exploit myopically. I sometimes think that it makes Herman Melville's Moby Dick the sort of most prescient study of the modern character. We're all on the Pequod, a ship named for an extinct indigenous tribe in North America. Ahab's in charge, and as Ahab said, my means are saying my motive and my object mad, and not standing up, especially for students in this room, is a squandering of not only the possibilities for your generation, but all succeeding generations. It is, actually that grave. that these corporate forces in theological terms are systems of death. And the more they suck us dry,